It's Morning at NTV. Once again, thank you so much for being with us. Wednesday's edition. It is the 17th of April 2024, and already the month is looking like it's wrapping up business for itself. Question is, are you wrapping or unwrapping your own business? Well, the quest of Morning at NTV is to help you unwrap your business for the day. Now, speaking of business for the day, in our Tech Note, we're going to be having an analysis of Uganda and the refugee problem, the impact of funding on refugee challenges that presently do exist. I am Priscilla Regina Naloga. Welcome to our discussion. Now, to just give you a backbone of it, Refugee Response partners here in Uganda do play a crucial role when it comes to providing protection, when it comes to providing assistance, as well as solutions to the over 1.6 million refugees and asylum seekers that we do have in our country. As you know, statistically, Uganda is known as one of the best hosting countries on the African continent. However, when it comes to funding, you do have the overall funding shortage impacting the already existing livelihood opportunities and severely impacting food security, also impacting other elements, and as well as exacerbating the growing influx of new arrivals. 2023 would be a perfect example when we did have the war on our neighboring side, the border, DRC into Uganda. Ever so often, especially between the months of August to October, November, we did see a lot of refugees seeking asylum on the Ugandan side, and so that influx there became a challenge. So you get to look at a group of stakeholders that highlighted yesterday at the Media House a contribution that has been pulled to curtail the challenges of underfunding to refugee status, and this is focusing on Uganda. Now, to provide more details to this, we're privileged to be hosting the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. The representative is amidst us, Mr. Matthew Crentsil. You are most welcome.
Thank you, Priscilla.
It's a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, pleasure to be here too.
Salutations to our audience.
Yes, good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to discuss this subject, which is of utmost importance to the government of Uganda. Yes. So I'm privileged and happy to be here to have this conversation with you.
The first thing that we would like to know, what is the current status of refugees in our country?
Yeah, you rightly mentioned that we have 1.6 million refugees here in Uganda. Actually, the number is going up as we speak now. It's about 1.66 million and counting. Over the last 2.5 years, we've had an additional 300,000 coming to Uganda. With respect to seeking refuge, Uganda is a safe haven for many nationals, especially nationals in the neighboring countries, because of the peace and security that they enjoy here. So it's not by accident that Uganda hosts the highest number of refugees in Africa, and also the third highest hosts of refugees in the world. Yeah. And the refugee population here is mainly made up of Congolese refugees and South Sudanese refugees. Actually, South Sudanese constitute about 56% of the 1.66 million refugees here. The Congolese about 31%, and the rest spread amongst Somali refugees, Burundians, Eritreans, and so on and so forth, and other nationalities as well. I mean, some come from far, even outside the continent, to seek refuge here in Uganda.
Okay, so when they do come to seek refugee, I know at the end of the day, it's all humanity, and we must observe their rights that they must enjoy, even if they are in a different country altogether for whatever reasons that bring them to Uganda. And so it begs the question, what are the rights that refugees ought to be having off their fingertips that they know they walk with them and carry with them and should advocate to exercise them?
No, I mean, to make it very brief, refugees enjoy all rights that Ugandans enjoy, except for the right to vote. Let me start from there. Refugees have access, enjoy the right to education, to employment, to exercise their profession, right to religion, right to freedom of movement in Uganda. Uganda's asylum policy is one of the best, one of the most generous in the world. I mean, whereby refugees can live anywhere in the country. But there is a condition that to live in urban areas, you should be able to fend for yourself, so that you're not dependent on humanitarian assistance, even though you will still have access to legal representation and other benefits that the humanitarian actors provide, but to live in an urban center, I mean, you should be able to fend for yourself. Otherwise, you are encouraged to live in the settlements. And here I would like to draw a very clear distinction between what is happening in Uganda and what happens elsewhere. In many countries, refugees live in camps. And to get out of these camps, they require permission to get out of the camps. Here, refugees can live anywhere in the country. They live side by side the local host communities. Sometimes they engage in similar endeavors or joint endeavors like in businesses, small businesses, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So this is quite unique. In so doing, and I would like to also use this opportunity to emphasize the need for peaceful coexistence between refugees and the host communities. Because they have access to the right of movement within the country, and because they live in the host communities, sometimes some people may not understand and they feel that refugees are a burden to the communities. But on the contrary, refugees don't come empty-handed. They have skills. They can contribute to the economy of the host communities. So it's a good thing that Uganda has opened its doors and has guaranteed freedom of movement of refugees. I also want to underscore the fact that due to the presence of refugees from 2018 down, UNHCR started something that, for the sake of the audience, to break it down, like the Global Compact on Refugees, where refugee matters are not the preserve of the government and UNHCR alone, but an all-society approach. And since then, we've had actors who, prior to 2018, were classified as development partners. The World Bank is one such example, and therefore did not actually intervene directly in refugee matters. But since then, the World Bank and other development actors have stepped forward and are able to give development funding in refugee hosting areas. Here, because refugees are living side by side the host communities, all our programs target both refugees and the host community. This is to ensure that there is peaceful coexistence among them. It would be very unfortunate, counterproductive to have parallel systems of assistance for refugees and the host community. Oftentimes, refugees go to host communities that have similar challenges like refugees, similar protection and assistance challenges, and so on and so forth. That is what makes the response to refugee issues in Uganda quite unique. And I can cite a few examples also. I mentioned that development actors like the World Bank and so have stepped up providing support to the host communities. Since 2018 and counting, about 1.1 billion US dollars have been availed to districts that are hosting refugees for developmental activities. You see some very, beautiful district administrative buildings, some road networks, education facilities, health facilities in host communities to serve both refugees and the hosts.
Okay. In that regard, looking at coexistence, even though the picture should be sweet and smooth, it's not the reality on the ground. I know that there's friction and challenges that are forced by either side, the refugees and then the hosting communities that do, allow them in. One of them is education. When you look at how they get absorbed into the education system, there is that stigma and a few barriers that they do face. When it comes to the business that you have talked about, the hosting community members could look at them as people who have come to take over what little they have already in their communities. And so let's speak into those challenges for both sides.
Yeah, ordinarily this would be so, but everything is relative in this world. According to scale, there would always be such misunderstanding, of the host communities. But in Uganda, I'm happy to say that it's on the very, very low level when it comes to hostilities. There would be hostilities even if there were no refugees. Among neighboring ethnic groups, and so on and so forth. So to put it in that context, it is not a big issue here in Uganda. I mean, in other places it's been worse. I mean, serious, fatal clashes between hosts and refugees. There have been incidents here in Uganda, let me admit to that, but because they are living side by side and they work together, and oftentimes their ethnic groups are quite similar, since they just come across the borders, and then they come to ethnic groups or communities that have similar cultures and similar practices and so on and so forth. There are cases whereby practices may be different. Sorry. Practices may be different, but we work together with government. I mean, the government is in the lead when it comes to hosting refugees. UNHCR and the UN are just here to support what the government is doing. Okay. So we work with relevant government authorities like the Department of Refugees under the Office of the Prime Minister to ensure that there is peaceful coexistence.
Speaking of governance, what are the favorable existing refugee policies in the country?
I mentioned it at the beginning that the most favorable is freedom of movement, freedom and access to employment. Refugees can practice their profession in Uganda without any difficulties. And if they are involved in gainful employment, why not to contribute and pay taxes as well? And many of them are doing so. Freedom of religion is guaranteed. Access to justice is also guaranteed. These are things that we don't have to take for granted, because elsewhere the situation can be quite dire.
Okay, all right. Now let's look at the other existing and registered operational refugee-led organizations such as the UNHCR. In regards to the work that you do, what has so far been recognized as the continuous impact on refugee communities in Uganda?
Let me make a clarification here. UNHCR is not a refugee-led organization. Refugee-led organizations are organizations that have been founded by refugees. So I'm not so sure which one precisely you are referring to.
No, I was talking about refugee-led organizations and operational organizations that support refugees.
Yeah, that's right.
As yourself.
I mean, when it comes to peace education and sensitization of the refugee community, it is quite well done by refugee-led organizations. Organizations that have been founded by refugees. They understand the culture of the refugees more. And by the way, the refugees come with different professions. There are very qualified people among the refugees. So we, instead of just letting them be in the settlements without being engaged, they can be put to productive use. That's why we encourage them to form such organizations. And oftentimes they partner with host community members as well. I've met many refugee-led organizations that are composed, even the management is composed of Ugandans and refugees. They engage in community outreach, sensitization, and joint ventures like livelihood projects. It could be agriculture or any other manufacturing, small-scale manufacturing endeavors in the settlements. So we encourage that, even though some of them face some challenges, I should say, challenges with registration, and also because they are small organizations, their capacity to manage resources is quite low. So these are the challenges that we are helping and working to overcome by capacitating them more, so that they would be able to manage the resources that we channel to them. But for these organizations, we don't channel much resources. It could be up to a maximum of maybe $12,000 per year for an organization, a small-scale organization. We encourage this because the work they do is much less expensive than engaging NGOs, particularly international NGOs, whose expenses would be high. I mean, for obvious reasons. Yeah, so that, in a nutshell, that is it. They are called refugee-led organizations, all right, but they also include Ugandans as well.
Okay. On that regard, in order for all that to happen comfortably, it requires a favorable environment, which I believe the state has provided, but it also comes down to resources, especially financing of this kind of work. When it comes to financing, how are you able to broaden your financing base to be able to support work here in regards to refugees?
Yes. UNHCR's sources of funding is voluntary contributions from member states of the UN, private organizations, individuals. I mean, it's purely on voluntary basis. Practically all the funding that UNHCR receives is from such sources. That is why we continue to advocate for more and more of such resources. Unfortunately, it is the same, practically the same donors who are funding all the displacement responses around the world. This puts a strain on the few donors, so we try to broaden the base. Last year, December, I signed an agreement with the Private Sector Foundation of Uganda, for example, to encourage its members to engage in business ventures in the settlements by way of helping to even create employment for refugees and host communities. Refugees occupy a very large area here in Uganda. Put together, it's about 1,162 square kilometers. And this is 2 times the size of Nairobi and 4 times the size of New York. So it's a very, very large area. The economic and market potential of that area put together is really huge. So we have to take advantage of it. It will be a win-win. I mean, the private sector engages in different ventures there, create employment for refugees and host communities. Refugees gain, they also gain. Nobody loses here. And once the host community sees the benefit of refugees, of hosting refugees, then it helps them to live very, very peacefully with the refugees as well.
Okay. What are the challenges are you currently facing in your quest to actually aid the enabling environment for refugees?
I mean, one of the first issues which I needed to elaborate a bit further is funding. Funding has been dwindling. Let me just give an example. For the whole entire refugee response, last year, for example, we needed about 846 million US dollars for the entire refugee per year. By the end of the year, we had managed to raise only 294 million. That's only 35% of the requirements. And that's not for UNHCR alone. For UNHCR, WFP, for food, for other UN organizations, for NGOs, so on and so forth. Despite the fact that the numbers of refugees are going up, funding is going down. Like I said, because displacements around the globe keep increasing. An example is that in 2019, total displacement in the Eastern Horn of Africa was about 12.5 million. As we speak, it's about 15.5 million. 3 million increase in 4 or 5 years' time. All of whom require support. Many of those, or the majority of those, are internally displaced and not refugees as such. So we continue to advocate for funding. This year, UNHCR would need about 343 million US dollars. As we speak, we only have about $62 million in. So we continue to count on our donors and non-traditional partners, to step up and support, because already Uganda is sacrificing a lot. If we were to put together, I mentioned the size of the area that refugees occupy, the impact on the environment, what the communities have to sacrifice. If we quantify that, it could probably be much more than what we are receiving in cash from other donors as well. So we are encouraging everyone not to forget about the refugee situation in Uganda, because we have new situations happening. Ukraine, for example, recently Gaza, and so on and so forth. But the old situation still persists. So we don't have to forget about what is termed the protracted refugee situation. We have to continue to work hard towards addressing them, whilst UNHCR and humanitarian organizations are working to provide humanitarian assistance to them. There are other institutions. I mean, the Secretary General himself is at the forefront of ensuring that the root causes of refugee issues are eradicated. I mean, advocating with governments and encouraging everybody to ensure that some of these causes are eradicated. In Africa, one of the major causes of refugees is public disturbance. I mean, or disturbance of the public order, let me put it that way. Communal violence, and so on and so forth. Civil wars that generate a lot of refugees. So looking for peace is critical because many of the refugees in Africa and mostly around the world have been the result of disturbances in the countries of origin.
Okay, all right. In that regard also, I know that you are closely working with the government. You did mention through the Office of the Prime Minister, you do offer your services to supporting refugees in the country. And so let's talk about that relationship with government and how it's being harnessed.
I mean, it's a luxury, let me put it that way. It's very, very fluid relationship with government. Like I said, UNHCR is here to support the government. And I must say we are fortunate to have a very engaging, very responsible and understanding counterpart, the Ministry of Relief, Disaster Preparedness and Refugees, and working very closely with the Refugee Department. I mean, we meet on a daily basis. It's like two sides of the same coin. I mean, we are all pulling in the same direction, and therefore we enjoy a lot of support and cooperation, I mean, from government. And it's not only the Office of the Prime Minister or the Refugee Department, for Ministry of Local Government as well. I mean, we are working with other ministries as well. I mean, there's one area that, one area of work of UNHCR that is often not highlighted, prevention of statelessness. They're working with the Ministry of Justice on that to cater to very few, individuals who are stateless, and those who are at risk of statelessness also here in Uganda.
Okay, let's also look at, for example, the refugee-led organizations, their success towards the Uganda Refugee Response framework.
Their success towards, I mean, they contribute a lot by way of, I had mentioned it in person, sensitization, peace education, which is key. It's often overlooked. And then engagement in productive activities that would engage the youth. You know, we have a very big percentage of the refugee population being youth. About 24% of the 1.66 million refugees are the youth. So it's very, very important to engage them. And you see that many of the refugee-led organizations are made up of the youth. So they contribute a lot, I mean, towards ensuring that, I mean, it's a win-win for themselves and also for the communities as well. I mean, here is one area that we intend to strengthen more and more because they are much less expensive. Programs are quite customized, I mean, because they take into consideration the traditions and practices of the refugee communities as well as the hosts as well. And this is also in line with a pledge that Uganda government made at the recently held Global Refugee Forum, that was December last year, on localization. I mean, why do you continue to engage international organizations to discharge such functions when locally you can have the refugees themselves as well as the host community get involved in this? More and more we are also working with the district local governments who are actually administering these settlements, administering the districts and then the villages around the settlements. So we are trying as much as possible to have a local response to the refugee situation. And it's a journey that we have embarked on, and then we hope to strengthen that and ensure that the refugee response is less and less expensive and more effective.
Okay. In closing, I like that you mentioned the word localization. So when it comes to funding, are there avenues and strategies of localizing funding so that you can be able to support the budget that you do have?
Yeah, like I mentioned, we are working more and more with the Private Sector Foundation of Uganda. So that is a form of achieving the same results without necessarily seeking for resources from elsewhere. That is one. We are also encouraging development actors as much as possible to ensure that refugee services are well integrated in public services, so that eventually when these services, national systems are strengthened, they will be able to cater to the refugees as well. This is all form of localization. Otherwise, we will continue doing the same old practices whereby assistance is kind of imported. I mean, through NGOs and so on and so forth. This is something that we are trying to address.
Okay, all right. And of course, the final question one would be asking, with the influx, how do we intend to treat it? And is there a possibility of, how can I put it, not having more refugees? I know that's definitely incumbent on what else is happening within, for example, the East African community. But at the point of them coming into a hosting country such as Uganda, and then quickly being processed into Ugandan system to be able to continue coexistence and continue with their livelihoods, that trajectory, do you expect it to stay as it is, or because of what's going on, for example, in Congo and South Sudan, we expect numbers to increase?
Not my expectation. Yeah. I would rather talk about my wish. My wish is that you don't keep receiving them, but the reality is that conditions in these countries are still not the best. Yeah. So some may still be coming. But there's also some good news here. We've had many South Sudanese particularly, and even some Congolese, return voluntarily to their countries. If we didn't have that, the numbers would be more than 1.66 million. We did a verification and reprofiling exercise that ended last year. Through that exercise, we realized that more than 200,000 people did not show up, which means they had most probably they had returned voluntarily to their countries of origin. Okay. But this is counterbalanced by the influx. I mean, the continuous influx from these countries. Right. We hope that efforts are being made by the Secretary General and the regional bodies to ensure peace, to eradicate the root causes of these influxes will be successful, so that we have less and less refugees coming to Uganda. Okay, all right. Mr. Matthew, your closing remarks to our audience. Yes, what I would like to say is, I mean, first of all, to thank the government and people of Uganda, I mean, for being so generous, opening your doors to the many thousands of refugees who are here in Uganda, and to encourage peaceful coexistence. I mean, to say that refugees may also have, and oftentimes they do have a lot to contribute to the communities by way of, I mean, engaging in meaningful, productive ventures. So we should see this as an advantage and an asset rather than a liability. By and large, I mean, they are all our brothers and sisters. I mean, due to unfortunate circumstances in their own countries, they find themselves here in Uganda. And Uganda has been widely acclaimed as the best hosts, I mean, in Africa, and I wish and pray that this would continue. All right, thank you so much, Mr. Matthew Crentsil, for your visit here at MorningAtNTV, speaking into the analysis of Uganda as far as the refugee problem is concerned and the great work that the UNHCR is doing. That brings us to the end of our Tech Note. Our Kickstarter is coming up, and they're equally going to be looking at matters of national economic importance. Do stay with us.